The heavy crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom at Montgomery Crest did not merely illuminate the evening. They bathed 250 of Lexington, Kentucky's most powerful elites in a warm, suffocating gold. Outside, a late spring rain washed over the bluegrass paddocks of my 300-acre thoroughbred estate, but inside the air was thick with the scent of $500 Napa Valley Cabernet, expensive French perfumes, and the unspoken arrogance of unearned wealth. United States senators, Wall Street hedge fund managers, horse racing magnates, and national press correspondents clinked crystal flutes beneath 80-foot vaulted ceilings, completely oblivious to the ground upon which they stood. I had spent the last 5 hours down at the primary foaling barn in my faded canvas jacket and my worn tweed suit, the exact same suit I had worn 35 years ago when my late wife, Evelyn, and I stood before a county clerk to sign the original deed to this land. A prize thoroughbred mare had suffered severe complications during labor at dusk, and my calloused hands were still stained with the dark, rich earth of the paddock yards and the faint scent of fresh pine shavings. I did not enter my own home through the grand rotunda to seek applause, demand attention, or make a sweeping political statement. I simply stepped into the side corridor to fetch a dry towel and a warm cup of black coffee before returning to the stables to watch over the newborn foal. But in modern high society, a man covered in honest dirt is viewed as an eyesore by those who have never bled for a single dollar they spend. As I glided past the soaring marble pillars toward the central mahogany staircase, the heavy murmur of classical violin music was suddenly sliced open by the sharp heel clicks of high fashion. My 35-year-old son, Julian, stepped directly into my path, flanked by his wife, Giselle Vance Montgomery, a woman whose family name was synonymous with Manhattan real estate ambition and whose smile was as cold and engineered as surgical steel. Julian was wearing a $7,000 bespoke velvet tuxedo funded entirely by my family trust, his cheeks flushed with 90-proof bourbon and unearned confidence. Beside him, Giselle held a crystal glass of vintage Cabernet, her eyes narrowing as she took in my muddy leather work boots, my frayed tweed collar, and the deep, heavy lines etched into my face. The entire ballroom fell into a hushed, expectant stillness as she stepped forward, making certain that 4 television news cameras and dozens of prominent guests observed her every movement. "Look what the rain just dragged into our gala," Giselle declared, her voice elevated just enough to shatter the ambient jazz ensemble. With a smooth, practiced flick of her wrist, she tilted her glass and poured the dark red wine directly over the lapels of my tweed suit. The icy liquid soaked through my shirt, cold against my skin, as the dark stain spread like an open wound across the fabric. "You senile old fool," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom, yet maintaining a mask of polite disgust for the surrounding crowd. "This is the Vance Montgomery Derby Gala, not a homeless shelter for retired yard workers. Security! Get this former barn laborer out of our estate and throw him into the rear supply shed before the national press photographers arrive." Before the security team could even step forward, Julian aggressively closed the distance between us, his breath heavy with the scent of bourbon. Instead of looking away or offering a single word of restraint, he reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out a thick stack of crisp $100 bills, and slapped them hard against my chest, letting the notes flutter down into the puddle of spilled wine resting at my boots. "Take the cash, Dad, and get the hell out," Julian whispered with measured malice, loud enough for the front row of politicians to hear. "Take a cab to some cheap motel out on the interstate and stay there until Sunday. You're an embarrassment to this family. You look like a senile janitor who lost his way. And Giselle's relatives don't need a dirty, stable hand ruining our brand on national television." If they expected me to yell, to raise my fists in anger, or to plead for dignity in front of their wealthy peers, they showed how little they ever understood about the blood that ran in their own veins. I spent 35 years sitting on the federal bench watching desperate, arrogant men destroy their own lives because they mistook composure for weakness. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I slowly leaned down, my spine straight despite the heavy ache in my lower back, and gathered the wet $100 bills one by one from the cold marble floor. I folded the paper neatly, creasing the edges between my thumb and forefinger with deliberate, mathematical precision, and slipped the stack gently into the front pocket of Julian's velvet tuxedo jacket. I pulled out a clean linen handkerchief, wiped the Cabernet from my chest, and held my son's gaze. The exact same eyes that used to look up at me from a hospital bed when he was 7 years old and terrified of the dark. I offered him a very small, impassive smile, a smile not of defeat but of complete and absolute clarity. "Congratulations on a magnificent evening, Julian," I murmured with measured restraint, my voice steady, low, and calm enough to cut through the heavy atmosphere of the room. "Enjoy your party." As I turned toward the side exit, my eyes swept across the gallery of onlookers who spectated the humiliation. That was when the second knife went far deeper than the first. Standing near the grand spiral staircase, holding a gold-plated smartphone mounted on a ring light stabilizer, was my youngest daughter. Chloe, the girl I had personally escorted down the aisle, the child whose Ivy League tuition I had paid in full without a single moment of hesitation. She was not watching me with sympathy, regret, or shame. She was giggling into her microphone, live streaming the entire degradation to her 800,000 social media followers, narrating my humiliation with a bright, artificial enthusiasm. "Guys, you won't believe this. My broke, eccentric dad just tried to crash our elite Derby Eve gala looking like a yard boy. And Giselle literally just threw wine all over his suit. Look at his face right now. Hit the like button, and leave a comment if you think he should go back to the supply shed where he belongs." I stood there for 3 seconds under the harsh glare of her phone light, watching my own daughter trade her father's dignity for digital applause and viral metrics. In that single moment, the last lingering thread of hesitation in my heart snapped cleanly in two. I uttered not a word to Chloe. I cast no second glance at Giselle. I simply stepped out the heavy oak side doors into the cold, driving Kentucky rain, leaving their laughter and camera flashes behind me in the golden warmth of the ballroom. The journey from the main mansion to my private woodworking workshop at the far edge of the estate stretched nearly half a mile down a dark gravel path lined with ancient white oak trees. The rain poured heavily, soaking through my tweed jacket and chilling me to the bone, but the cold water felt clean compared to the air inside that house. My workshop was a sanctuary built from reclaimed barn timber, a space smelling of dried cedar, linseed oil, and decades of honest craftsmanship. I unlocked the heavy iron door, pushed it open, and crossed the threshold, the hum of the storm outside settling into a dull roar against the tin roof. I lit the small wood-burning stove in the corner, removed my soaked jacket, and poured myself a cup of black coffee from the pot resting on the iron stovetop. On the wall above my workbench hung a framed black-and-white photograph of my late wife, Evelyn. She was standing right in front of the main house 30 years ago, wearing a simple linen dress, her hands covered in garden soil as she planted the very rose bushes that Giselle's guests were currently trampling under their designer heels. Evelyn was the moral heart of our family, the anchor that kept us grounded when our investments began to grow into millions. When she passed away 4 years ago from cancer, I promised her I would protect our children, that I would give them time to find their footing and learn the value of hard work. For 4 years, I pretended to be a simple, retired old man who preferred living in a workshop and tending to horses, allowing Julian and Giselle to run the estate's day-to-day public image because I thought generosity would breed gratitude. I had allowed them to believe that the wealth was theirs to manage, hoping that responsibility would turn my son into a man. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, after the music at the main house finally died down and the last valet-parked luxury cars pulled away into the night, I navigated back up to the house through the mud to retrieve my personal medical records and leather journal from the primary study. The front doors rested unlocked, the grand foyer littered with empty champagne flutes, crumpled napkins, and spilled liquor. But as I stepped into the central parlor, my breath caught in my throat, and a cold, heavy ache settled deep within my chest. Hanging above the carved stone fireplace had always been Evelyn's master portrait, a massive, oil-painted canvas commissioned on our 30th wedding anniversary, capturing her warmth, her quiet dignity, and the gentle strength that built this farm. It was the centerpiece of our home, the one thing I had explicitly instructed my children never to touch under any circumstances. The portrait was gone. In its place hung a massive, garish, neon-lit acrylic billboard featuring a larger-than-life photo of Giselle, posing in a silk gown, emblazoned with the bold gold lettering of her new lifestyle brand. The Vance Montgomery Estate, curated by Giselle. I observed the floor near the service hallway. Resting against the baseboards, right next to an overflowing trash bin filled with dirty party plates and empty wine bottles, was Evelyn's portrait. The gilded wooden frame was cracked at the corner, and a sharp, jagged tear ran right through the canvas near her hands where someone had carelessly shoved a metal clothing rack against it. I approached, knelt in the cold darkness of the parlor, and gently brushed the dust and dried champagne off my wife's painted face. I shed not a single tear. The grief that had weighed down my heart for 4 years suddenly evaporated, replaced by something cold, heavy, and mathematically absolute. They had not just taken my money. They had attempted to erase the woman who made their very existence possible. They believed that because I chose silence, I was powerless. They believed that because I chose humility, I lacked teeth. I lifted the damaged portrait, carried it carefully back to my workshop through the rain, and set it gently against my workbench. I sat at my desk, unclipped a fountain pen, unlocked the iron safe beneath the floorboards, and opened the master ledger containing the deeds to the Montgomery Family Trust, the private corporations holding 68% of the estate, and the legal documentation for every bank account funding Julian's lifestyle. The clock on the workshop wall ticked steadily toward 3 in the morning. The storm outside was settling, but in the dark corners of Lexington, the storm I was about to unleash upon my children was only just beginning. The rain continued to hammer relentlessly against the tin roof of my woodworking workshop, creating a steady, rhythmic roar that filled the damp night air. But inside, behind the thick timber walls, the atmosphere remained cold, still, and heavy with absolute purpose. I set Evelyn's damaged portrait gently against the cedar workbench, carefully smoothing a sharp crease near her hands where the fine oil canvas had been torn by a metal clothing rack. For 4 long years, I had allowed my children and the public to believe that Thorne Montgomery was nothing more than a broken, retired old man, a grieving widower who spent his twilight years tending to thoroughbred horses in the barns and nursing an obsession with timber joinery. They saw a man in faded canvas jackets and muddy work boots, someone who sat patiently and without complaint at the far end of the dinner table while his son and daughter-in-law dictated the family's public affairs and spent money they had never earned. What they failed to realize was that humility is not helplessness, and deliberate silence is never a sign of surrender. In the rear corner of my workshop, concealed behind a false wall of stacked, aged white oak timber, sat a heavy reinforced steel security door leading down a flight of concrete stairs into a subterranean vault built beneath the farm 30 years ago. I flipped the main breaker and warm, recessed LED lights illuminated a private subterranean office that no one in my family, not Julian, not Giselle, not Chloe, even knew existed. This room did not smell of fresh pine sawdust, horse feed, or wet soil. It smelled of old leather-bound ledgers, heavy bond legal paper, and cold, unyielding financial truth. Resting inside the floor-and-cord steel safe was the master ledger of the Montgomery Family Trust. I held 68% of the voting shares and full legal ownership of the 300-acre Lexington estate, the historic paddocks, the breeding stables, and the underlying commercial real estate portfolio, valued at well over $120 million. Under the strict ironclad terms of the irrevocable trust agreement I had drafted after retiring from 35 years on the federal bench, Julian was merely a conditional beneficiary with strictly limited operational access, serving at my sole discretion. He owned nothing. The grand estate he boasted about to his high society friends at the country club, the luxury sports cars parked in the circular driveway, and the executive title he wore like a crown were entirely dependent on my continued restraint and goodwill. As I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk to pull the master accounting files and review the recent wire logs, a sudden spell of dizziness hit me, a familiar, dull fog that had been creeping into the back of my mind over the past 3 months. I had initially attributed it to grief, fatigue, and the natural weight of passing years. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small plastic amber bottle containing my daily blood pressure medication, prescribed years ago by our longtime family physician. I unscrewed the cap and poured 2 small white round tablets into my palm. But as the bright overhead lights struck the surface of the tablets, my eyes caught a subtle irregularity. I had taken this specific prescription for over a decade. The imprint on the authentic pharmaceutical tablets was always engraved with a sharp, crisp serial code and a distinct dividing line. These pills were completely smooth, slightly chalky, and bore no manufacturer markings at all. My hand froze in midair. A cold sensation, far sharper than the rainwater soaking my tweed jacket, crept slowly down my spine. I stood up, glided over to my desk microscope, a high-precision optical tool I used to examine fine wood grain and antique furniture joinery, and placed one of the tablets under the lens. I crushed a fraction of the pill and ran a basic chemical identification solvent across the compound, a residual testing habit from my decades presiding over complex federal narcotics and corporate fraud trials. Within 90 seconds, the chemical test strip turned a dark, unmistakable toxic violet. It was not antihypertensive medication. It was a compounding mixture of a low-grade neurological sedative and a synthetic anticholinergic compound, a deliberate, slow-acting drug designed to induce short-term memory loss, chronic mental disorientation, and physical symptoms mimicking early-stage vascular dementia. Julian hadn't just insulted me at the Derby Eve Gala. He hadn't just kicked me out into the driving rain to protect his wife's vanity and artificial social status. He had been systematically poisoning his own father for 90 consecutive days. He was not waiting for me to pass away naturally. He was actively engineering a fraudulent medical paper trail to have me declared legally incompetent, incapacitated by cognitive decline, so that he could petition the Fayette County Probate Court to strip my voting rights and seize absolute, unchallengeable control of the Montgomery Family Trust. The depth of their betrayal was not merely financial. It was a cold, calculated assault on my humanity. But sitting in that vault surrounded by decades of legal truth, I felt no rage, only the unwavering resolve of a man who knows that justice is best served cold, precise, and without hesitation. The discovery of the altered medication shifted something fundamental deep inside me. The aching grief in my heart transformed instantly into an absolute, unshakable calm. Anger is an emotional luxury reserved for the weak. Mathematical precision is the weapon of a man who intends to settle a debt. I picked up my secure satellite line, bypassed the local switchboards, and dialed a private number I hadn't called in 3 years. Hank Bear Miller answered on the second ring. Hank was a retired Fayette County Sheriff's Chief Deputy who had served beside me during my years presiding over the federal district court. He was a man of few words, heavy shoulders, unyielding loyalty, and an unmatched expertise in tactical surveillance. 20 minutes later, his unmarked black pickup truck pulled down the rear gravel lane behind my workshop, its headlights killed before it reached the trees. Hank stepped through the workshop door without a word, carrying a heavy Pelican case containing commercial-grade, encrypted surveillance hardware and digital monitoring equipment. "Thorne," Hank said, his voice low, heavy, and gravelly as he examined the wet, wine-stained tweed jacket hanging over my chair and the crushed white tablet resting beneath the microscope lens. "I heard about the spectacle up at the main house tonight. The whole county is talking about how your son's wife treated you in front of the press cameras." "The spectacle was just the bait, Hank," I replied impassively, pointing to the chemical test results resting on the desk blotter. "Take a look at this." Hank leaned over the microscope, his weathered face darkening as he analyzed the laboratory report sheet. His jaw tightened until the muscles bulged along his neck. "This is attempted manslaughter and felony elder abuse, Thorne. I can have state troopers and the State Bureau of Investigation at the main house in 15 minutes. "No," I said with measured restraint, setting my hand firmly on his arm. "If the police march in tonight, his high-priced corporate lawyers will tie this up in bail hearings, venue changes, and procedural motions for 2 years. He will blame the pharmacy, blame a rogue maid, or blame my own failing memory. I don't want a legal compromise, Hank. I don't want a plea bargain. I want absolute, undeniable closure. I want them caught in the exact net they constructed with their own hands. Over the next 2 hours, while Julian, Giselle, and their remaining high society guests were celebrating in the main mansion above, Hank and I executed a silent deployment across the estate. Using secondary master access keys I had kept since building the mansion 30 years ago, we accessed the primary utility conduits and service crawl spaces running beneath the main house. Hank installed 3 micro-lens 4K cameras and ultra-sensitive directional microphones inside the ceiling, molding and air ducts of the main study, the exact soundproofed room where Julian conducted his private business affairs and held his late-night strategy sessions. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the live feed was encrypted and streaming directly onto the high-resolution tablet resting on my vault desk. I put on my reading glasses, poured a fresh mug of black coffee, and began monitoring the live recordings from the past 48 hours that had been automatically backed up on the mansion's internal network server. What I witnessed through those monitors was far worse than ordinary financial greed. It was a cold-blooded, methodical slaughter of my life's work. On the high-definition video feed recorded the previous afternoon, Julian was sitting behind my late wife's mahogany desk, swirling a glass of 20-year-old single malt scotch. Sitting across from him was Giselle and a slick, sharp-suited man named Dominic, a disgraced former Wall Street broker who ran an unregistered offshore cryptocurrency hedge fund out of Miami. "The mandatory quarterly audit is coming up at the end of the month, Julian." Dominic's voice boomed clearly through my noise-canceling headphones. "If your old man wakes up for even 10 minutes and looks at the master trust ledger, you're completely finished. You've pulled $4.5 million out of the trust's primary capital reserve account over the last 8 months just to cover your margin calls on those failed Bitcoin leverage trades." Julian didn't flinch. He leaned back in my executive leather chair, putting his muddy designer boots up on the polished wood. "The old man isn't looking at anything, Dominic. His brain is completely fogged out. He spends all day down in the barn talking to horses and carving wood blocks like an idiot. Giselle's doctor friend has been adjusting his blood pressure supplements for 12 weeks. By the time the Derby Festival ends next week, we'll have the medical board sign the formal petition for emergency conservatorship." Giselle laughed, filing her manicured nails with an icy, sociopathic composure. "And once the conservatorship goes through and Sterling is legally declared incapacitated, we sign the master deed over to the foreign syndicate for $45 million cash. We take our cut, buy the Gulfstream jet we looked at in Atlanta, and put Thorne into that private care facility down near the Mexican border in El Paso. The one that doesn't allow unannounced family visits or independent medical inspectors. He can spend his remaining years staring out the window at the desert fence." Chloe walked into the frame, holding her smartphone on a ring light gimbal. Hey, just make sure my lifestyle brand sponsorship gets funded out of the closing proceeds. I need $200,000 for the spring launch event in Miami. You'll get your money, Chloe, Julian said with an arrogant smirk. The old man spent 30 years building an empire, but he was too soft to use it properly. It's our turn now. I sat in the cold vault beneath my workshop, watching my 3 children laugh together about shipping their father to an isolated desert facility after stealing $4.5 million of his life savings. My chest did not heave. My hands did not shake. I took off my headphones, laid them neatly beside the tablet, and let out a long, deliberate breath of absolute finality. If you were in my shoes, would you have confronted them right there at the party, or remained silent and waited for the legal trap to spring? Comment A for immediate confrontation, or B for patient revenge. At 6:30 on Friday morning, as the first pale gray light of dawn broke over the misty pastures of Lexington, a dark blue sedan pulled into the private gravel lane behind my workshop. Stepping out of the vehicle was federal attorney Marcus Vance, a legendary legal mind who had spent 30 years prosecuting high-level white-collar financial fraud before the United States Court of Appeals. Marcus was not merely an attorney. He was a trusted lifelong friend who knew the exact structural foundation upon which the Montgomery Family Trust had been constructed. I met him at the workshop door, handing him a hot cup of black coffee as he carried a heavy leather briefcase inside. We sat down at my workbench, surrounded by the rich smell of cedar shavings, linseed oil, and the humming of the wood stove, and laid out the evidence spread across the desk. They went far beyond greed, Thorne, Marcus stated, his brow furrowing deeply as he reviewed the chemical laboratory analysis of the altered pills, the video recordings of the financial conspiracy, and the forensic bank statements showing the unauthorized $4.5 million wire transfers to Dominic's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. This isn't just an internal family dispute anymore. This is grand larceny, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, and felony elder abuse under both federal and state statutes. I don't just want them indicted, Marcus, I said in a low, even tone, my voice carrying the cold, unyielding weight of an anvil. I want every single legal asset they think they possess stripped away before they even realize a federal court has convened. I want the legal trap sealed so tightly that not even a shadow can slip through. Marcus pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper, his sharp eyes flashing with professional admiration. Then we execute immediately under Kentucky Code Graph 386B.4, the Uniform Trust Code provisions governing irrevocable family trusts and fiduciary duties. He pointed his pen to the specific statutory clauses highlighted in yellow ink. Because you retained absolute status as the settlor and primary managing trustee, and because we now have undeniable forensic proof of a severe breach of fiduciary duty and intentional elder abuse, we don't need a lengthy civil trial to strip Julian of his power. Under Kentucky Revised Statute Section 386B.8, we are filing an emergency ex parte petition with the Chief Judge of the Federal District Court this morning. What does that give us operational control over? I inquired calmly. It gives us 3 immediate devastating legal levers, Marcus explained, leaning forward across the workbench. First, it triggers an immediate mandatory forensic financial audit over every account, shell company, and real estate asset connected to the Montgomery name. Second, under the elder abuse and fraud revocation clauses, it automatically revokes Julian, Giselle, and Chloe's status as contingent beneficiaries. They are legally disinherited as of 8 o'clock this morning. They no longer possess a legal right to a single cent of this estate, the trust, or your personal holdings. Marcus slid a final document across the table, a crisp, red-stamped emergency judicial order signed by the Chief Judge of the District Court. Third, and most importantly, it grants us an immediate frozen injunction over all auxiliary credit lines, corporate accounts, and property deeds. As of this exact second, Julian's executive authority is completely dead. He is holding a steering wheel that isn't connected to the engine anymore. I observed the judicial document, feeling the cool paper beneath my calloused fingers. And the sale of the farm? The $45 million deal they plan to sign with the foreign syndicate during the Derby Gala's final dinner tomorrow night? Marcus smiled, a thin, dangerous smile that held no warmth at all. We let them proceed right up to the final signature. We let them invite their foreign buyers, their investors, their high society friends, and the television press. We let them stand at the podium, completely convinced they are about to become multimillionaires. And right when Julian raises the pen to sign away your life's work, we drop the hammer. They have spent 4 years convincing themselves that age equals helplessness, Marcus added, snapping his briefcase shut with a sharp metal click. They forgot that long before you were a grieving father living in a woodworking shop, you were a federal judge who sent corporate embezzlers and organized fraud rings to federal penitentiaries. Tomorrow night, we bring the full weight of the federal justice system down on their heads. Drop the name of your city or state in the comments below. Let me know where our community of silent, hardworking fathers is watching from tonight. By Friday afternoon, 24 hours before the grand closing gala, the unseen machinery of my retaliation was operating with absolute mathematical perfection. From my subterranean vault, with Marcus sitting beside me and a team of federal forensic accountants working remotely through secured servers, I began systematically severing every financial lifeline my children used to project their false social status. First came the corporate black credit cards. Giselle was currently at an ultra-exclusive equestrian boutique in downtown Lexington, accompanied by her entourage of high society wives, attempting to purchase a $24,000 custom diamond necklace for tomorrow night's televised celebration. With a single keystroke on my secure terminal, I revoked her authorized user status and placed a security freeze on the primary merchant account. Through the remote audio feed installed in her luxury vehicle, I heard the precise moment the trap sprung. The boutique manager politely informed Giselle that her card had been flagged for immediate revocation due to unauthorized corporate usage, forcing her to abandon her luxury purchases in front of her gossiping peers, her face burning with sudden, unscripted humiliation. Next came Julian's financial lifeline. He had placed a $100,000 earnest money deposit using the trust's primary operational account to lease a luxury private box at the Keeneland racecourse for his foreign buyers. I executed an immediate clawback under the emergency forensic audit order, freezing his corporate liquidity and placing a total freeze on his personal bank accounts pending federal review. Finally, I turned my attention to the main mansion itself. Using the master utility management system registered under my name, I revoked the administrative Wi-Fi access, restricted the automated security gates, and redirected all master estate mail and courier deliveries to my private workshop box. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, I stood by the window of my workshop, watching from behind the cedar blinds. A heavy, expensive flatbed tow truck pulled down the main driveway, carrying official impound notices from the Fayette County Sheriff's Office. Because the $85,000 luxury SUV Julian had leased was funded through fraudulent wire transfers from the frozen trust account, the leasing company had issued an immediate repossession order. Julian ran out onto the front porch in his silk shirt, his face pale, waving his hands frantically at the tow truck driver. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Do you know who I am? I am Julian Montgomery. I run this estate. Drop that vehicle right now or I'll have your license revoked." The tow truck driver didn't even cast a glance at him. He simply handed Julian a red-stamped legal notice from the district court, hitched the luxury SUV onto the hydraulic lift, and drove away, leaving my son standing alone in the middle of his grand driveway, surrounded by the cold Kentucky drizzle. A few minutes later, Julian's phone rang. It was his lead accountant calling to inform him that every corporate card, every credit line, and every bank account associated with the Montgomery name had been completely frozen by an unknown judicial injunction. Through the surveillance microphone mounted in the main hallway, I heard Giselle's sharp, terrified voice ring out from the grand foyer. "Julian, what is happening?" "The caterers just canceled the food orders for tomorrow's gala. The florist said our deposit bounced. My cards are declined everywhere. What did you do?" Julian stood in the center of the parlor, staring blankly at the empty space above the fireplace where his wife's garish advertisement hung, his hands trembling violently as he tried to dial his father's number. In his pocket, his phone buzzed continuously, but I did not answer. My phone rested on my desk beside Evelyn's damaged portrait, the screen lighting up with his desperate calls before going dark once again. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, took a seat in my wooden rocking chair by the stove, and observed the rain falling over the dark paddocks. The initial phase was complete. They had spent months planning to strip my dignity, my home, and my mind away from me. They had assumed that because an old father remains quiet, he is blind to the world around him. Tomorrow night, at the grand closing gala of the Derby Festival, in front of 200 of the state's most prominent figures, the foreign buyers, and the national press, my children were going to learn the most painful lesson of their lives. They were about to discover that when a quiet man finally decides to speak, his voice does not just fill a room, it tears down kingdoms. I sat back in my wooden chair, listening to the rain beat a steady rhythm against the cedar siding of the workshop. The trap was set, the evidence was logged in triple redundancy, and the judicial orders were officially signed and sealed. In 24 hours, my children would stand before the world and answer for every insult, every stolen dollar, and every attempt to erase their mother's memory. Saturday evening arrived with the crisp, heavy chill of late autumn settling over Fayette County. The grand ballroom of the Lexington Grand Hotel was a vast sea of glittering crystal chandeliers, gilded mirrors, and polished mahogany tables. Over 200 of Kentucky's most influential figures had assembled. High-stakes thoroughbred breeders, Wall Street hedge fund managers, political heavyweights, and national television journalists equipped with high-definition broadcast cameras. The heavy air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, $300 champagne, and the toxic arrogance of unearned financial triumph. At the head of the room stood a massive press riser, flanked by two 30-foot digital projection screens displaying a rendered graphic of my 300-acre estate. Above the image of my paddocks, my home, and my late wife Evelyn's rose gardens ran a bold golden banner, the Montgomery Estate Acquisition, a new era of luxury. My 35-year-old son Julian stood behind the podium, wearing a $7,000 tailored tuxedo, a diamond-encrusted watch flashing on his wrist. Beside him stood his wife, Giselle Vance Montgomery, clad in an emerald silk evening gown, her hair sculpted to perfection, her face beaming for the flashing cameras. My youngest daughter, Chloe, was standing near the front row, holding her gold-plated phone, live-streaming the entire affair to her social media followers with a bright, rehearsed smile. Julian raised his crystal glass, the ice clinking softly as the room fell into an eager, expectant hush. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and members of the press," Julian began, his voice amplified across the surround sound speaker system, dripping with theatrical confidence. "Tonight marks the realization of a grand vision. My late mother always dreamed of seeing this estate reach its full financial potential, and my father, who has gracefully stepped back from public life due to his advancing age and failing health, has entrusted me with the stewardship of our family's legacy. Tonight we sign the final $50 million merger agreement with our international partners, officially transitioning the Montgomery Holdings into a global luxury resort brand." The room erupted into polite, aristocratic applause. Giselle stepped forward, holding a silver tray bearing a heavy gold-plated fountain pen, offering it to the lead representative of the foreign investment syndicate sitting across the table. Julian unscrewed the cap of the pen, holding it high over the 500-page acquisition document for the photojournalists to capture. "To the future," Julian declared, lowering the pen toward the signature line before the tip of the nib could touch the paper. The massive 8-foot-tall carved oak doors at the rear of the ballroom burst open with a heavy booming crash that rattled the crystal chandeliers above. The applause died instantly. 200 heads turned in unison toward the entrance. Stepping through the threshold was not a broken, senile old man in muddy leather boots and a stained canvas coat. I entered the ballroom wearing a bespoke midnight blue wool suit tailored precisely to my broad shoulders, a crisp white sea island cotton shirt, and a dark silk tie fastened with absolute mathematical precision. The deep, weathered lines of my face did not convey exhaustion or confusion. They carried the cold, unshakable authority of a man who had presided over the federal bench for 35 years. Walking on my left was Federal Attorney Marcus Vance, carrying a heavy leather briefcase stamped with the official seal of the United States District Court. Walking on my right were two sharp-eyed special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division, their dark suits, brass tie clips, and subtle earpieces radiating an undeniable lethal authority. Behind us stepped 4 uniformed Fayette County Sheriff's deputies, their leather duty belts creaking softly in the sudden, suffocating silence of the hall. My heavy leather shoes struck the polished marble floor with a slow, deliberate cadence. Clack, clack, clack. Each step echoing through the room like the striking of a gavel. Julian's hand froze 2 inches above the signature page. The color drained from his face so fast, so completely, that he looked as though he had seen a ghost rising from an open grave. Giselle's practiced smile shattered, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the podium until her knuckles turned ghostly white. I stopped 10 feet from the head table, folded my hands behind my back, and observed my son directly in the eyes. "Put the pen down, Julian," I said. My voice was not loud. I did not shout. I did not raise my pitch. But carried by decades of judicial presence, my low baritone cut through the silence of that ballroom like a razor through silk, freezing every soul in the room. The quiet weight of 35 years sitting in judgment over men who believed they could outsmart the law was written into every line of my posture. I cast no glance at the press. I paid no mind to the foreign buyers. My eyes were locked solely onto my son. I had watched him grow from a wide-eyed child in the barn into a man who believed that luxury was a right and that honor was something to be bought and sold. Standing in the center of that golden ballroom, surrounded by 200 of the state's most powerful elites, I felt no hatred, only the profound, immovable resolve of a father who had come to collect a long-overdue debt. The atmosphere in the room shifted from celebratory opulence to an icy, suffocating dread. The television cameras, which Julian had invited to capture his moment of ultimate triumph, were now zoomed in on his trembling hands and pale face. The high society guests, who had spent the evening sipping his champagne and praising his commercial vision, began taking subtle steps backward, distancing themselves from the head table as if treason and fraud were contagious diseases. "Dad?" Julian's voice cracked badly, dropping an octave into a high-pitched, desperate squeak that was picked up by every microphone in the hall. What are you doing here? Security." "Why is he here? He's confused. He's supposed to be at his residence." Special Agent Miller of the FBI stepped forward, extending his arm toward the house security guards who were hesitating near the perimeter. "Federal agents, nobody moves, nobody touches those documents, and nobody leaves this room." Marcus Vance stepped up to the audiovisual control console near the stage. Without asking for permission, he plugged an encrypted silver flash drive directly into the master broadcasting deck. Members of the press and distinguished guests, Marcus's voice boomed over the room's sound system. "Before any documents are signed tonight, the United States District Court requires the disclosure of the true status of the Montgomery Family Trust." The rendered graphic of the luxury resort on the two massive projection screens vanished instantly. In its place, the high-definition video surveillance feed from my study flashed onto the displays in 40-foot resolution. The crystal-clear audio roared through the ballroom speakers. The entire audience watched and listened as Julian sat in my late wife's chair, swirling scotch, boasting about stealing $4.5 million from my retirement reserves to cover his failed cryptocurrency margin calls. "The old man isn't looking at anything, Dominic." Julian's recorded voice echoed loudly across the ballroom, shocking the politicians and businessmen who had just been applauding him. "His brain is fogged out. Giselle's doctor friend has been adjusting his blood pressure supplements. By the time the Derby Festival ends next week, we'll have the medical board sign the petition for emergency conservatorship. We put Thorne into that private care facility down near the Mexican border in El Paso. He can spend his remaining years looking at the desert." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the 200 guests. Women covered their mouths in disbelief. Prominent horse breeders shook their heads in absolute disgust. Next on the screen flashed the forensic bank statements, highlighted in bright red. 64 unauthorized wire transfers. The chemical toxicology reports proving my blood pressure medication had been systematically replaced with cognitive sedatives, and the certified judicial order signed at 8 o'clock that morning under Kentucky Code 386B.4. Marcus looked at the international buyers sitting at the table. As of 8 a.m. yesterday, Mr. Julian Montgomery was legally stripped of all trustee authority, disinherited from the estate, and stripped of all voting shares due to felony breach of fiduciary duty and intentional elder abuse. Any contract signed by his hand is legally void, fraudulent, and subject to immediate federal prosecution. The lead representative of the foreign syndicate stood up, shoved his papers into his briefcase without saying a single word to Julian, gave me a respectful nod of apology, and exited the hall flanked by his security team. No, this is a mistake. This is an AI fabrication. He's trying to ruin me," Julian screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he slapped his palms against the podium, tears of pure panic welling in his eyes. Special Agent Miller stepped onto the stage, pulling a pair of heavy stainless steel peerless handcuffs from his belt. "Julian Montgomery," Agent Miller declared in a flat, factual voice that echoed off the high ceilings. "You are under arrest by authority of the United States government for wire fraud under 18 U.S. Code 1343, bank fraud under 18 U.S. Code 1344, and felony elder financial exploitation under Kentucky revised statutes. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Snap, clink. The metallic sound of the handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Julian's wrists echoed through the silent ballroom. Giselle let out a sharp, pierced shriek, backing away from her husband as if his touch were contagious. She grabbed her designer leather handbag from the chair and turned to bolt toward the private service exit near the rear. "Mrs. Montgomery, stop right there," a female FBI agent barked, stepping into her path. "Get your hands off me," Giselle shrieked, her face contorted in a mask of ugly, hysterical rage. "I am a Vance. My family owns real estate in Manhattan. I had nothing to do with his business. I didn't sign anything. Every luxury item, every piece of jewelry, and that handbag in your hands were purchased directly using wire-transferred funds from the stolen trust account." The agent replied coldly, taking the bag from her hands and placing a forfeiture tag on it. "All personal assets acquired through the proceeds of wire fraud are subject to immediate federal asset forfeiture. You are named as a co-conspirator in the federal indictment. Step forward." Before the eyes of her high society peers, the press cameras, and the guests she had sought to impress, Giselle's wrists were pulled behind her back, and steel cuffs were locked securely into place over her diamond bracelets. Chloe stood near the front row, her phone slipping from her fingers and smashing against the marble floor. She looked at me, her face pale, her lip trembling as she realized her online brand, her funding, and her social standing had evaporated in less than 10 minutes. She tried to step toward me, reaching out a hand, but the cold, impassive gaze I gave her stopped her dead in her tracks. The room was paralyzed in total disbelief. The high society figures who had spent years kissing Julian's ring now turned their backs, whispering in polite disgust as federal authorities systematically dismantled his carefully constructed lie. On the massive 30-foot displays, the video loop continued to play, capturing every toxic word, every arrogant laugh, and every detail of their conspiracy to poison my mind and lock me away in a desert facility. The foreign buyers sitting across the table were men of cold, calculated business. They did not care about family drama, but they understood federal fraud indictments and frozen trust assets better than anyone. The lead representative closed his leather portfolio with a sharp snap, looked at Julian with an expression of pure contempt, and spoke 2 words in a low, sharp tone before leaving the room: unforgivable disgrace. The sheriff's deputies began clearing the room, escorting the stunned, whispering guests toward the exits while photojournalists snapped dozens of high-resolution photographs of Julian and Giselle being led away in federal custody. As Agent Miller guided Julian down the stage steps toward the side exit, my son's composure completely collapsed. The arrogance, the smug velvet tuxedo posture, and the cold disdain he had displayed at the gala 2 nights ago vanished into thin air, replaced by the raw, pathetic terror of a child who had finally realized the world was not going to protect him from his own sins. Julian stumbled over his own feet, dragging his polished shoes against the carpet, and dropped hard onto his knees right at my feet. The handcuffs clinked against the marble floor. Tears streamed down his cheeks, smearing his expensive collar, as he lifted his bound hands toward me, trying frantically to grab the hem of my midnight blue suit jacket. Dad, please," Julian sobbed, his voice cracking into jagged, desperate gasps that echoed through the emptying hall. "Please, Dad, don't do this to me. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we can handle this inside the family. I'm your son, Dad. I'm your only son. You raised me. Mom would never want you to put me in prison. Please, Dad, I'm begging you. Tell them to take these cuffs off." I stood entirely still. I did not step back. I did not raise my voice. I observed the 35-year-old man weeping on his knees in front of me. The boy I had taught to ride horses in the green paddocks. The boy whose Ivy League tuition I had paid. The man who had sat in my home 48 hours ago and planned to ship his father to a desert care facility after stealing his life's work. I felt no surges of anger. I felt no burning desire for vengeance. What I felt in that moment was a vast, heavy sorrow, a grief for the child he used to be, and an absolute clarity regarding the monster he had become. I slowly leaned down, my spine straight, bringing my face close to his ear so that only he could hear the words I was about to say. "When you poured that wine over my suit on Thursday night, Julian," I whispered, my voice as calm, steady, and cold as deep winter ice, "you told your friends that an old man's dignity has no value. You taught me that respect must be paid for. Today, my son, you are going to pay your bill." Julian's breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened in absolute, paralyzing terror as he realized that the soft, forgiving father he had exploited for 4 years no longer existed. The man standing over him was the federal judge who had sworn an oath to uphold justice without fear or favor. He lay there on the cold marble floor, weeping like a child who had finally realized that his father's love was no longer a shield against his own destruction. The lesson was complete, written in the cold steel ratcheting around his wrists. For 4 years, he had believed that his title, his expensive suits, and his wife's Manhattan connections made him invincible. He had mistook my endurance for weakness, my patience for senility, and my generosity for a blank check. "Look at me, Julian," I said softly, my voice cutting through his frantic weeping. He lifted his tear-stained face, his eyes wide and bloodshot, pleading for a mercy he had never shown to anyone else. "For 35 years, I continued, I sat on the federal bench and watched men just like you. Men who believed that money could buy morality, and that status was a substitute for character. I warned you when you were young that the world always demands payment for arrogance. You chose not to listen. Today, the world has arrived to collect." He reached out once more with his cuffed hands, his fingers brushing the leather of my dress shoes, but Agent Miller stepped in, placing a firm hand on his shoulder and hoisting him up off the marble floor. I stood back up, smoothed the lapels of my dark suit, and looked at Agent Miller. "Take him away, Agent," I said softly. Julian screamed my name one last time. "Dad, Dad." As the federal agents pulled him up by his arms and escorted him out the heavy oak service doors into the cold Kentucky night, where the red and blue emergency lights of 3 federal cruisers were flashing against the dark glass of the hotel entrance, the sun was setting by the time I returned to the 300-acre estate in Lexington. The rain that had battered the bluegrass hills for 3 days had finally stopped, leaving the evening air sharp, clean, and carrying the faint, sweet scent of damp cedar, wet earth, and fresh pine paddocks. The grand mansion at the top of the hill rested dark and silent. There were no valet-parked cars, no classical violin orchestras playing in the rotunda, no social media cameras flashing in the halls, and no arrogant voices laughing over stolen champagne. I pulled off my dark suit jacket, draped it neatly over the passenger seat of my vintage pickup truck, and walked down the gentle slope toward the private wooden dock extending over the estate's mirror-like lake. The sky above the Kentucky hills was painted in deep, dramatic hues of copper, amber, and indigo. The reflection of the ancient white oak trees stretched across the still water, undisturbed by the wind. I walked to the very end of the wooden dock, where my late wife Evelyn and I used to sit on summer evenings 30 years ago, watching our children chase fireflies in the tall pasture grass. I took a deep breath, letting the cold, crisp evening air fill my lungs, air that no longer carried the suffocating weight of deceit, betrayal, or silent endurance. I sat down on the wooden bench, resting my calloused hands on my knees, and pulled out my old pocket watch, the one Evelyn had given me on the day I was sworn on to the federal bench. The steady, rhythmic ticking of the mechanical gears was the only sound in the vast, peaceful countryside. Tack, tick, tack. Many people who watch a story like mine unfold ask the same question. How could a father do that to his own blood? How could a man allow his own son to walk away in handcuffs? Do you not feel regret? Do you not feel the urge to soften the blow? I look out at the copper light reflecting off the water, and my answer is always the same. Not for a single second. A father's ultimate duty to his children is not to shield them from the painful realities of the world. It is not to surrender his own dignity, his honor, and his life's labor so that his offspring can live in unearned luxury and arrogant entitlement. A soft heart without firm boundaries is not love. It is negligence. It is an open invitation for those you care about to ruin their own souls. I gave my son 35 years of unconditional support. I gave him a name respected across this state, an education paid for in full, a home to shelter his family, and a second chance when he failed. What I failed to give him sooner was a consequence. When you allow a child to cross sacred lines without facing the weight of their choices, you do not protect them. You destroy them. You turn them into predators who believe the world owes them everything, and that human dignity can be stepped on without a cost. Sometimes the greatest, most profound act of love a father can perform is to step out of the way, lower the shield, and let the cold, unyielding hammer of the world strike his children down until they hit rock bottom. Because only at rock bottom, stripped of their false status, their stolen wealth, and their arrogant illusions, can they finally learn what it means to be a human being. Real family justice is never loud. It does not shout in anger, it does not throw fits in the street, and it does not seek petty vengeance. It is patient, it is mathematically certain. As the last golden rays of twilight dissolved behind the silhouettes of the Kentucky pines, I stood up from the wooden bench, holding my wife's pocket watch close to my chest. The air grew colder, but my heart was lighter than it had been in 4 long years. The estate was safe, Evelyn's memory was restored to its rightful place above the stone hearth, and the law had done what soft fatherly love could never accomplish. The road ahead would be calm, but it would be built on truth, dignity, and unyielding honor. I closed the pocket watch with a soft, metallic click, slipped it into my vest pocket, and turned back toward the dark house on the hill. Tomorrow I would wake up at dawn, walk down to the foaling barn in my canvas jacket, check on the newborn thoroughbred filly, and begin repairing the broken wooden frame around Evelyn's portrait. The storm was over. The estate was calm. And for the first time in 4 long years, the air inside my home felt clean. To every silent, hard-working father watching tonight from your living rooms, your workshops, your trucks, and your farms across this nation, do not apologize for drawing your line. Do not allow your kindness to be mistaken for weakness, and never let your soft heart become a carpet for ungrateful hands to walk upon. Your dignity is non-negotiable. Your life's labor is sacred. Take care of yourselves, gentlemen. Keep your boundaries firm, keep your conscience clean, and sleep well tonight, because when a quiet father finally decides to draw the line, the whole world backs up.